So we've talked a lot about slavery and slave owners and just about slavery in general. One topic we didn't talk much about were the wives of slave owners. And I read a small section in the textbook, I believe you can find it on page 450, about slave owners' wives, plantation mistresses. And it made me kind of curious because we don't really know much about them, so that's what I decided to do my research on. So I made a small PowerPoint. It's pretty basic, but it'll just help to keep you up with what I'm going through. So plantation mistresses. The mistress of a plantation was the most complete slave on it. You'll see what I mean by that quote a little bit later, why I included it. So a few of my research questions are as included here. What was life on a plantation for a mistress actually like? How did they interact with their slaves? How much domestic work did they actually do since they owned slaves? Did their slaves do a lot of the work for them? How did the traditional views of paternalism affect them? I'll describe more of that in detail later. And what were their own personal beliefs? So, as for their duties, they obviously had domestic tasks and maternal tasks. For their domestic tasks, the plantation would have what is called the big house, which was basically the biggest house on the plantation, and plantation owners would try to make this very extravagant to show how wealthy they were. The big house often would have a detached kitchen, a separate smokehouse, and storehouses. The household obviously then required much upkeep and daily work, as well as caring and feeding of all those, the slaves and the white, who lived on the plantation. So that made the plantation mistress's work pretty big. Some of the homemaking tasks that she would take care of are caring of the slaves. She was also to distribute food and often supervise the field that supplied the big house. And other activities she performed are gardening, dairy activities, preserving fruits and vegetables, mixing medicine, making candles, soap, rug, pillows, linen, bedding, and so on. So basically it seemed like her work would never end. As for maternal tasks, once a young Southern woman was married, basically her sole duty was to please her husband. Part of this duty was to produce children, heirs and family for her family, and citizens for the South. There was a big black population, so increasing the number of whites was a big deal. As for how she interacted with slaves, I was a little bit curious about this, wondering if women were as bad as the men were often brought out to be. And what I discovered was a plantation mistress sort of acted as a mediator between the master and the slaves, though she never viewed them as equal with her. She dealt much with the slaves in their care, like I said, distributing food and supplies. And in an essay I read by Chris Thompson, you'll see that in my citation, he quotes a piece of Mary S. Hofschild's book. In Mary S. Hofschild's comparison of the diaries and journals of 3 slaveholding women, she notes, their diaries indicate the slaveholding women saw the slaves simultaneously as human beings and as property. As a more compassionate gender, they did feel for their workforce, but they generally did not feel a sort of bond with them, though this does not mean it was always the case. As for treatment of slaves, in another article I read by Bynum, some slaveholding women were compassionate to their slaves, and some were less understanding, and even had contempt for their slaves. So basically, it kind of depended on the person. Still, slaves would often prefer dealing with their mistresses over their masters. Another question I thought of when I was thinking about doing my research is, did they often have their slaves help bring up their children? And yes, they sometimes would have slaves help supervise the children, but there was one piece I read, and I want to read this to you. One woman wrote in 1818 of her fears of her daughter. Owing to Jules' carelessness, the child had been frequently of weight, very bruised and injured by falls. She let her fall this morning from the upper platform down 2 flights of stairs, and I fear her back is injured, but no visible marks have yet appeared, except her jaw and tongue are very much bruised and cut. I rarely go from home, since I know I can never put feet outside my door without something of the kind occurring. So even though they would do that, they still did want to raise their kids themselves, and also were a little bit fearful of leaving the slaves with their children. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the effects of paternalism. Paternalism can be defined as a policy or practice of treating or governing people in a fatherly manner, especially by providing for their needs without giving them rights or responsibilities. So we can see this in two different ways in the South. First, the traditional views of the man as the house of the household, and the man also owning the slaves. So women were under men and slaves were under white people. This was very big in the South, and women were also thought of mainly as ornaments, you can almost say, and property of the family. Only men were in charge, and although a mother had supervision over slaves and children, the father clearly ruled the household. No matter what the strength of her will or influence might be, male authority had domination. In another article I read, Erin Mulligan wrote more on the topic of paternalism in her journal, Paternalism and the South Hierarchy. In this article, she talks about how paternalism affected the women of the South and how it also supported slavery. Slave ownerships helped give women a sense of power. They had this false sense of being superior to blacks because of race, and they were in fact in charge of caring for them and overseeing them, which is why they felt powerful, because they were, in a sense, superior to these people because of the color of their skin. Another thing was church. Since a lot of slaveholders tended to be religious, church helped strengthen the ideas of paternalism in the South. It helped cement a woman's view of her motherly role in the South as ordained by God. It was a Christian duty for her to be caring for her family and slaves. Finally, I did some research on what plantation mistresses' views. How do they feel about being the submissive wife, ownership of their husbands, and how did they feel about slavery? Well, as for their religion, a lot of them were churchgoers, because living on a plantation, they would often be very isolated because they couldn't go anywhere without chaperones, which they didn't have, so they didn't have an opportunity to get out much. So they liked going to church because it gave them a chance. It was like an outlet for them, and they gave them a chance to socialize. Participation in church membership was pretty common among slave owners' wives. This also helped strengthen the idea that a woman's motherly and submissive role was ordained by God, as I said before. It was their job to care for their family and to oversee the slaves and help care for the slaves as well. Then the second question, were they for or were they against slavery? Well, as I mentioned before, owning slaves seemed to give them a sense of power, and they thought they were doing good work for caring for the slaves. Southern women would also sometimes argue that their slaves were better cared for than, say, the factory workers of the North, who had terrible pay and living conditions. And there was a book I read, or at least skimmed through, about Louisa McCord, and she was pretty interesting because she was widowed and she overtook her husband's plantation, but even though she had become a strong, independent woman and she was into her writing, she would do lots of, I guess you could consider it political writing, she didn't support women's rights, and then also she didn't support freedom of slaves. She deviated from what people would have expected from a woman of her status, and she believed that slavery was just part of a natural order, just as women are to be submissive to men, as did most slave-owning wives, in my opinion. So, yeah, you could say plantation owner wives definitely didn't have an easy life. They worked hard, and they also were, for the most part, okay with it, I guess. And then here at the end, you can see my citations. There's a lot I could have talked about and expanded more on that I would have loved to share with you guys, but of course I have to keep this under 10 minutes. But if you are interested in learning more, I definitely suggest reading The Plantation Mistress by Katherine Clinton and possibly Within the Plantation Household by Elizabeth Fox Genovese. Those are both really good books that contributed a lot to the research I did.